She lost everything, but what happened next turned her darkest night into an unforgettable miracle of hope. She never thought her life could change so fast. Amina had once believed that stability meant safety, and safety meant her small world would always stay in place. She had a job that covered basic needs, a modest apartment that felt like home, and a routine that made life predictable. Nothing fancy, nothing extraordinary, but enough to survive with dignity. Every morning she would wake up early, prepare herself, and leave for work with her daughter Sarah in her thoughts. There was struggle, yes, but it was the kind of struggle she understood and could manage. She never imagined that one day even that fragile balance would disappear completely. It began with something she didn't fully understand at first. The factory where she worked started reducing hours. People whispered about financial losses, about management problems, about possible closure, but Amina kept telling herself it would pass. She believed in tomorrow more than she feared today. But slowly the hours became fewer, the pay became irregular, and the tension in the workplace grew heavier. Colleagues started leaving one by one, looking for other jobs, but Amina held on because she had responsibilities she couldn't run away from. She needed that income, even if it was shrinking. Then came the day when everything stopped. The announcement was short, cold, and final. The factory was shutting down. No detailed explanation, no long apology, just an ending delivered like a routine notice. For a moment, Amina stood still as if her mind refused to accept what her ears had heard. Around her, people reacted with shock, anger, and confusion, but inside her there was only silence. A strange emptiness spread through her chest as she tried to process what this meant for her and her daughter. At first she told herself she would find something else quickly. She updated her small resume, walked from office to office, asked for opportunities with polite hope in her voice. But the world outside did not respond the way she expected. Doors stayed closed longer than she stood waiting. Some places didn't even bother to look at her properly before rejecting her. Each no felt heavier than the last, slowly breaking the confidence she once carried without effort. Days turned into weeks, and savings that once felt enough began disappearing into basic survival. The apartment that once felt like home slowly turned into a burden she could no longer carry. Rent notices started arriving, first gentle, then strict, then final. Each paper on the door felt like a countdown she could not stop. She tried to explain, to request more time, to promise payment soon, but promises don't stop deadlines. One morning, she returned from another failed job visit to find her door locked and her belongings placed outside. That moment didn't feel real. It felt like standing outside her own life, watching it continue without her. She held Sarah tightly that day, trying to understand what to do next, but there was no clear answer waiting for her. The noise of the city continued as usual. People walked past her without noticing the small collapse happening quietly at the side of the road. For the first time, she understood what it meant to have no direction left, no space left, and no safety left. The life she once managed so carefully had slipped away piece by piece until there was nothing stable enough to hold on to anymore. The first night on the streets didn't feel like real life to Amina. It felt like a mistake that would soon be corrected, like she would wake up and find herself back in her small apartment, hearing normal sounds again, making breakfast for Sarah like she always used to. But morning came, and nothing changed. The cold concrete beneath her, the distant noise of traffic, and the constant awareness that she had nowhere to go made it painfully clear that this was now her reality. She kept telling herself it was temporary, just a difficult phase that would pass quickly. But deep inside, she could already feel how easily people could disappear into this kind of life without anyone noticing. Her first priority was Sarah. The baby didn't understand what had happened, but she could feel the change. Hunger came faster now. Sleep became lighter and more restless. Amina would hold her close through the night, using her own body as a shield against the wind, trying to create warmth where there was none. She would walk slowly through different parts of the city during the day, not because she had a destination, but because movement distracted her from thinking too much about their situation. Sitting still made everything heavier, more real, more difficult to bear. Food became the first real challenge. At home, even when things were tight, she had always managed to cook something simple. Now even a small meal required effort, negotiation with fate, and sometimes humiliation. She would search for places where leftovers might be available, quietly observing from a distance before gathering enough courage to ask. Some shopkeepers would ignore her completely, pretending she wasn't there. Others would wave her away without words. A few would reluctantly give something small, not out of kindness, but discomfort, as if the act of helping her was something they wanted to finish quickly and forget immediately. Every small success in finding food felt like survival, but every failure felt like punishment. She learned quickly that hunger changes the way time feels. Hours stretch longer when the stomach is empty, and nights become harder when there is nothing to distract the mind. Sarah's soft cries would echo in her ears long after they stopped, and those sounds would stay with her even when the city around her was loud and busy. Finding safe places to sleep was another constant struggle. Parks were unpredictable, stations were crowded, and some corners of the city were simply unsafe. She started recognizing patterns in the environment, learning which areas were less likely to bring trouble and which ones should be avoided entirely. She would sit in places where light was available but attention was not, trying to balance visibility and invisibility at the same time. Too hidden meant danger, too exposed meant judgment or being moved away. There was no perfect place, only temporary choices made under pressure. Clean water, basic hygiene, and warmth became luxuries she no longer expected. She would plan her movements around public taps, restrooms, and places where she could at least wash her face and keep Sarah clean. Even these small routines required effort and timing. Everything in her life became calculated around survival, even things she once took for granted without thought. The emotional weight of it all was heavier than the physical struggle. The worst part was not the hunger or the cold, but the feeling of being unseen. People walked past her every day, talking, laughing, living their normal lives, while she felt like she existed in a separate layer of reality that no one acknowledged. Sometimes she would watch mothers with their children in parks and feel a strange mix of pain and distance, as if that life belonged to someone else in a different world. Yet even in this harsh rhythm of survival, she refused to let go completely. Every night she would quietly repeat to herself that this situation could not be the end of her story, that Sarah deserved more than this, and that somehow, even if she didn't know how, she would find a way to pull them out of this darkness before it became permanent. Amina slowly realized that survival on the streets was not only about food or shelter. It was also about how much a person could endure emotionally without breaking completely. And in her case, the only thing keeping her standing was the quiet responsibility she felt as a mother. Because every time exhaustion tried to take over her thoughts, she would look at Sarah's face and remember that giving up was not an option she was allowed to consider, even for a second. There were moments when her body felt like it could no longer continue, when her legs ached from walking all day, and her eyes struggled to stay open at night. But something deeper inside her refused to accept defeat, almost as if a part of her had switched into a protective mode that prioritized her child's needs above everything else, including her own pain, hunger, or fear. And this silent strength became her daily survival tool without her even fully realizing it. Every morning when the city started to wake up, she would gather whatever energy she had left from the night before and begin moving again, because stopping meant thinking too much, and thinking too much meant feeling everything she was trying to survive. So she learned to stay in motion, walking from one area to another, not knowing exactly what she was searching for, but convinced that staying still would make everything worse. She began to notice how easily people could look past her, how conversations would continue around her as if she was part of the background rather than a human being with a story. And instead of letting that destroy her completely, she used it in a strange way, turning invisibility into protection. Because if no one paid attention to her, then at least no one was actively harming her. And in that twisted logic, being unseen sometimes felt safer than being noticed. Even in moments of deep frustration, she never allowed herself to express anger in ways that would put Sarah at risk, because she understood that losing control in her situation could lead to consequences she would not be able to fix. So she trained herself to stay calm even when her emotions were collapsing inside, swallowing words that could have turned into cries or complaints, replacing them instead with silence and controlled breathing. She also developed a habit of observing everything around her in detail, learning which people seemed kind, which places were less hostile, and which routes through the city offered slightly better chances of finding help. And this constant awareness became her way of navigating a world that no longer felt designed for her survival, but still required her to move through it every day. At night, when Sarah finally fell asleep in her arms, Amina would sit awake for long periods, not because she wanted to, but because sleep often felt unsafe. And in those quiet hours she would reflect on everything she had lost, her job, her home, her sense of identity. And yet even in those painful reflections, she would come back to the same conclusion that no matter how much had been taken from her, she still had responsibility, and that responsibility gave her a reason to continue. There were also moments of emotional breakdown that she never showed in public, moments when she would turn her face away so Sarah would not see her tears, because she did not want her daughter's earliest memories of life to be filled with fear or sadness. And even though she had nothing material to offer, she still believed she could give her child emotional safety, even in the middle of instability. Some days she would quietly speak to Sarah as if the baby could fully understand her words, explaining small things about the world around them, not because she expected answers, but because speaking helped her stay connected to normal life, and because she wanted Sarah to hear a voice that sounded calm and hopeful, even when their situation was anything but that. Her strength was not loud or visible. It was not something that anyone passing by on the street would recognize, but it existed in small, repeated choices, in refusing to leave her child alone, in continuing to search for work even after rejection, in protecting Sarah from cold nights using only her own body, and in choosing every single day to continue despite having every reason to stop. And slowly, without realizing it, Amina transformed her suffering into endurance, and her endurance into a quiet determination that became the only stable thing in her unstable world. The turning point in Amina's life did not arrive like something dramatic or loud. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, as she sat one evening with Sarah wrapped tightly in her arms, watching the city move around her as usual, people rushing past with their own problems, cars passing under dim streetlights, shops closing one by one. And in that slow moment of exhaustion she felt something unusual, not hope yet, but a strange awareness that someone was watching her from a distance. At first she ignored it, because life on the streets teaches you to distrust attention, even when it seems harmless, but the feeling continued, subtle and consistent, like a presence that did not match the usual rhythm of strangers passing by. And when she finally looked up properly, she noticed an elderly woman standing a few steps away, not staring in judgment or curiosity like most people, but observing with a calm expression that felt almost out of place in that environment. Amina instinctively pulled Sarah closer, preparing herself for another rejection or uncomfortable interaction, because that had become the pattern of her life. People either ignored her or treated her as a problem to avoid. But the woman did neither. She simply stood there for a moment longer, as if trying to understand something beyond what was visible on the surface. And then slowly she approached and stopped at a respectful distance. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was soft and steady, not filled with pity or urgency, just simple human concern. And she asked a question that caught Amina slightly off guard because it was not about money or demands. It was about time, about how long she had been living like this. And Amina hesitated before answering, because she was not used to someone asking about her situation without immediately trying to judge or fix it in a harsh way. The conversation that followed was brief at first, careful and slow, as if both of them were testing the weight of each other's presence, and Amina found herself answering in short sentences, still guarded, still unsure of what this interaction meant, while the woman listened without interrupting, without looking away, without showing discomfort. And that alone made the moment feel different from everything she had experienced in weeks. Then came the offer, simple words inviting her to come somewhere safe for the night, and Amina immediately resisted it, because accepting help had started to feel like accepting dependency, something she was trying to avoid at all costs, even if it meant suffering. But the woman did not pressure her. She did not insist loudly or emotionally. She only said that the decision would affect the child as much as it affected her. And that single line created a silence that stayed between them for several seconds. Amina looked at Sarah again, sleeping weakly in her arms, and for the first time that evening her expression changed slightly, not because she trusted the woman completely, but because she could not ignore the reality of her child's condition, the cold, the fatigue, the instability of their current surroundings, and the fear that things could get worse if nothing changed soon. And that internal conflict became visible in the way she lowered her gaze and held Sarah closer without speaking. After a long pause that felt heavier than words, she agreed to follow, not because she fully believed, but because she felt she had no right to reject something that might protect her child. And the walk that followed felt unfamiliar, as she left behind the corner she had been staying at and moved through streets that suddenly felt different simply because she was walking toward something unknown instead of staying in place. The place they arrived at was not what she expected. There was warmth in the air, clean light instead of harsh street lamps, and a sense of order that made her feel slightly out of place, almost like stepping into a memory of a life she used to know but had forgotten how to access. And for a moment she hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether she was allowed to be there at all. Inside, she was given basic comfort without conditions, food that did not require asking, space that did not require negotiation, and silence that did not feel threatening. And this contrast was so overwhelming that she struggled to accept it fully at first. Because when a person has lived without stability for too long, safety itself can feel unreal or temporary. The elderly woman explained that this was a shelter meant for mothers in difficult situations, a place created not for charity in a distant sense, but for rebuilding lives in a practical way. And as she spoke, Amina listened carefully but still remained emotionally cautious, because experience had taught her that help often comes with hidden expectations or sudden withdrawal. It was only the next morning that the true shift began to take shape, when paperwork and records were being checked, and Amina's name triggered something unexpected in the system, causing a pause that changed the atmosphere in the room, and the woman's expression shifted slightly as she recognized a connection that Amina had no awareness of at that moment. What followed was a revelation that tied her past to the present, in a way she could not have predicted, a link to the factory she had once worked for. And suddenly the situation was no longer just about assistance. It became something deeper, something connected to responsibility and history. And Amina felt her stomach tighten as she prepared herself for the possibility that this connection might work against her instead of helping her. But instead of rejection, what came next was something entirely different. The woman did not turn her away. She did not question her worth. She did not reduce her to her circumstances. Instead, she acknowledged the past openly and spoke about change, about choices that had led to suffering, and about the possibility of repairing what could still be repaired in the present. Then she offered Amina something she had not expected in that moment, not just temporary shelter, but an opportunity to rebuild, to work, to learn, to step out of survival mode and into something resembling stability again. And for a moment, Amina could not respond because her mind struggled to process how quickly everything was shifting from hopelessness to possibility. And as the weight of that offer settled into her reality, something inside her finally broke open, not in despair this time, but in disbelief mixed with relief. Because after everything she had endured, the idea that her situation could change through a single encounter felt almost unreal. Yet it was standing in front of her as a living possibility that she could no longer ignore. At first, Amina did not believe that life could actually change in a lasting way, because everything she had experienced until that moment had taught her the opposite lesson, that good moments are temporary and struggle is permanent. So even after being taken into the shelter and given support, she remained emotionally cautious, almost waiting for the moment when it would all be taken away again. But days slowly turned into weeks, and for the first time in a long while, her life stopped being controlled only by survival instincts and started to include structure again, small routines that felt unfamiliar but safe, waking up in a clean space, having access to food without fear, and most importantly, being able to hold Sarah in a place where she did not have to constantly worry about cold nights or sudden danger. The shelter was not just a building, it was a transition space, a place where broken lives were not rushed back into the world, but gently guided toward stability. And Amina began to notice how different it felt to be surrounded by people who were not judging her past, but focusing on her future, women with similar stories, each carrying their own invisible weight, yet slowly learning to stand again. At first, even simple things felt overwhelming, filling out forms, attending basic training sessions, speaking to people without fear of rejection, because her confidence had been damaged by repeated failures outside. But slowly, through consistent support, she started to rebuild her sense of identity, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone capable of working again. Sarah became the emotional center of her healing process, because every improvement Amina made was connected to the thought that her child deserved a better environment, and that quiet responsibility continued to push her forward even on days when she felt mentally exhausted. Because now her struggle had direction instead of confusion. The elderly woman who had first brought her to the shelter remained present, not as a distant authority figure, but as someone who checked in regularly, offering guidance without control. And through her, Amina learned more about the foundation's purpose, how it was built to support mothers who had fallen through cracks in the system, and how it aimed to give them tools instead of temporary sympathy. One of the most important moments in her recovery came when she was offered training within the same organization, small administrative work at first, something simple that did not overwhelm her, but gave her a sense of contribution again, and the feeling of earning something through effort instead of depending on uncertainty slowly began to rebuild her confidence. There were still emotional setbacks, moments when memories of the street returned suddenly, especially at night when silence felt too deep, and she would wake up briefly with a sense of fear that everything she had gained might disappear. But over time, those moments became less frequent, replaced by a growing sense of stability that she had not felt in years. As she became more involved in the foundation's work, something unexpected happened. She started to recognize faces, situations, and even emotions in the new women arriving at the shelter. And each time she saw someone in that same state of fear and confusion she once lived in, she felt a strong emotional connection that made her want to help them not just professionally but personally. Her transformation was not sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, built through repetition, effort, and consistency. And with each passing month, she moved further away from the identity of someone surviving day by day, and closer to someone building a future step by step. Sarah, too, began to change in that environment, growing healthier, more playful, more expressive, as stability replaced uncertainty. And Amina often found herself watching her daughter sleep peacefully without fear, something that once felt impossible, and those moments became reminders of how far they had come from the nights under bridges and bus stops. Eventually, Amina was offered a permanent role within the organization, not as a beneficiary, but as a contributing member, someone whose lived experience had value. And that shift was deeply emotional for her because it marked the moment where her past suffering was no longer just something she survived, but something she could use to help others. On the day she received the official confirmation of her new position, she stood quietly for a long time, holding the letter in her hands, not because it was just a job, but because it represented a complete reversal of her story, from being someone who once had nothing to offer her child, to someone now able to provide stability, dignity, and hope. She returned home that evening to a small but safe apartment provided through the program, a place that was not luxurious but permanent enough to feel real. And as she opened the door with Sarah in her arms, she paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the contrast between where she once was and where she stood now. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to fully breathe without fear. That night, she did something she had not done for a very long time. She sat quietly beside her sleeping daughter, not in worry or exhaustion, but in gratitude, and she realized that hope had not come to her as a sudden miracle, but as a series of small chances she almost missed but chose to accept when she was given the opportunity. The biggest change in her life was not just financial stability or shelter. It was the restoration of dignity, the return of self-worth, and the understanding that her life had meaning beyond survival, and that even after falling into the lowest point, it was still possible to rise again if given support and courage at the right moment. And the most powerful truth she carried forward was simple, that people do not lose their value when they fall. They lose it only when the world stops offering them a way back up. And her journey became living proof that compassion, timing, and opportunity can completely transform a life that once seemed beyond repair. Moral of the story is that no situation is permanent. No hardship defines a person's entire future. And even in the darkest moments, a single act of kindness or a single opportunity can become the turning point that rebuilds an entire life, reminding us that hope is never truly lost. It is only waiting for the right moment to be given back again. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for inspirational and entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental. The purpose of this script is to spread hope, resilience, and positivity.